Resuming debate, the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to be here this afternoon. I'm not sure that I've seen a bill that's probably more emblematic of the Liberals than this bill itself. As I've sat here and listened today, I see there's all kinds of enthusiasm over there, but no assurance of any kind of effectiveness. There's all kinds of work being planned here, but likely to have no results. And there's all kinds of appointments in this mix, but it doesn't look like there's going to be any balance either. Liberals made a promise, Mr. Speaker, in the campaign, and their promise was that they were going to set up a non-partisan parliamentary national security oversight committee. And Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, C-22 is a broken promise, another broken promise from a government that is becoming famous for breaking them. I'm going to talk a few ways about how they've broken that promise, but certainly there's no opportunity for this to be non-partisan. There's no opportunity for it to actually be a real parliamentary committee, and it's certainly not going to have the oversight that it should have. There's several ways to set committees up around here, Mr. Speaker. The one that we thought that the Liberals were promising, they said they were going to have a non-partisan parliamentary committee, and I assume that if you put that in place, you'd be talking about equal numbers where the opposition would be able to contribute on an equal basis, that the power on that committee be shared perhaps with dual chairs or sharing the chairmanship. That would have the powers of a parliamentary committee. That if it was a security committee, that it would probably have to deal with some sort of secrecy issues around the content of what they're looking at. There's a second opportunity to set up a regular parliamentary committee that has parliamentary powers, and all of us in this House sit on those types of committees around here. They always pretty much favor the government because of the numbers that are on the committee are set by the numbers that we have in the House here, and so those committees are under the control of the government, and we recognize that. There's advisory committees of parliamentarians that can be set up, and then, Mr. Speaker, there's an advisory committee to the Prime Minister, and we know the specialization that the Liberals across the way have on consultation, but typically those committees are appointed by the Prime Minister himself. And it's interesting, I think, Mr. Speaker, that we saw the Liberals promise number one, which was that non-partisan parliamentary committee, and what they're actually trying to deliver today is that number four, which is that advisory committee to the Prime Minister, a committee that can consult with him and he can talk to them about these issues, but which has very little power. I want to take a little bit of a look at some of the other countries that are involved in these committees. I hear my colleagues across the way in the government, actually one of them a little while ago talked about the United States Intelligence Committee structure and was actually trying to compare this structure to that. And he talked about how there needs to be fairness, justice, and rule of law that's guaranteed and protected by this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that this bill does not do that. It doesn't compare virtually in any way to the structure that's set up in the United States. The previous speaker talked about the United Kingdom model and quoted as something that this is similar to. I'm going to go through that a bit as well, and I think we'll find out that this committee does not have that much similarity to the authority and power that the United Kingdom committees have either. We've got a number of other Commonwealth countries who do have oversight committees. New Zealand, for example, has a committee, but it basically is to examine issues of efficacy and efficiency, so budgetary matters, policy settings, and those kinds of things. So, Mr. Speaker, really doesn't have much to do directly with kind of that intelligence oversight, if you want to call that. And the members of that committee are the Prime Minister, 2 members of Parliament nominated by him, the Leader of the Opposition, and then 1 member nominated by the Leader of the Opposition. So you can see in that situation that the government of New Zealand would control that committee at all times. And it's basically focused on kind of oversight in terms of budget, but not in terms of the intelligence gathering. Australia has a little bit different model. They have a committee that's administrative, and the main functions are to do expenditure review and oversight there as well. And they can also review matters that relate to some of the agencies that are referred to them. But it doesn't review intelligence gathering, operational procedures, or priorities, and it doesn't conduct inquiries. So again, we see that it's an oversight committee, but not what the Liberal government across the way has promised to set up for a committee for Canadians. The United Kingdom has a little bit stronger committee. They have a committee of Parliament with greater powers. It was set up in actually 1994, more of a monitoring committee, and then in 2013 it was kind of restructured, reformed, if you want to call it that, to give it more powers and then to increase its strength. And that now includes oversight of operational activity, wider intelligence and security activities of government. I think when people were thinking about this committee that the Liberals were promising during the campaign, that they really thought that that was what was going to be brought in, and certainly isn't when we take a look at the legislation and what the Liberals are doing to the legislation and also to the work that the committee did. So Bill C-22 is called the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act. And Mr. Speaker, usually you name a committee for what it really is, and if that's the case here, it probably should be called the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee, because while it may establish a committee, it clearly fails to meet either the election promise or to establish a real and true intelligence oversight committee. And it's a bit of an embarrassment, I think, for the government. They find themselves having to completely change their direction from what they promised. And it's unfortunate we were here this afternoon. They're using time allocation then to basically cover their, I would call it, incompetence on this issue. And it's unfortunate we find ourselves once more in the situation where they want to limit debate on a bill that clearly is not going to meet the priorities and the needs of Canadians. And actually, I think that probably comes out of, we've got a Prime Minister who seems to love running around more and appearing on stages other places more than he likes to do this kind of hard work. And so it's not surprising that we see some of this legislation time after time that's written in ways that the government itself finds itself unable to support. They have to come in here, they have to reject the work of the committees, reject the amendments that are made by members from all parties in this Parliament, and then basically turn their back on the promises that they've made as well. This bill was introduced on June of 2016 and would try to set up this committee. But the interesting thing, Mr. Speaker, is that the Prime Minister had actually appointed a chair to this committee. And he appointed a chair to this committee months before the legislation was even presented and long before it was even debated. And I understand the member's been traveling around the world. I guess he's thinking he's doing some work on this committee, but it's probably a pretty good gig if you can get the appointment before the parliamentary committee is even set up, and then you can get the government to pay for you to travel around and examine some of these issues. And at least there's one person who's getting something out of this if the rest of Canadians aren't. But forming, as I said, an effective non-partisan committee was a Liberal campaign promise. I think that every one of us in this House would like to ensure that there's an appropriate review of our national security agencies. We know and we believe that that's important, and we would like to see that this committee, when it's set up, has the capacity and the tools to be able to do what was required. And I think we'd all be glad to support a committee that was established that would properly supervise and provide oversight to our national security and intelligence organizations. And the way this has been done and the way it's being done in the House this afternoon is actually a clear demonstration that this whole project is far more about optics than it ever is about effectiveness. We need to make sure, if we're going to be putting this committee in place, that it has the tools to do what's required, and that clearly has not happened. You just mentioned that the Prime Minister appointed a chairman of the committee far before the legislation was even written. Well, I think before it was written, certainly before it was presented, and far before it was debated. And that person actually, from my understanding, has very little expertise. Doesn't have a history in these issues or whatever. And one of the issues around here is that committees usually elect their own chairs, not ones imposed from the Prime Minister's office. Mr. Chair, I think I'm going to run out of time here probably before I'm done a lot of the things that I would like to say, but Liberals promised they were going to form this committee. It's not a parliamentary committee. It's controlled by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety. And I don't know how anyone in this House would see a committee that's set up like that could possibly be non-partisan. What does that mean when the Prime Minister has the authority to appoint the members of the committee? Again, as I mentioned earlier, if they really wanted to treat this seriously, why wouldn't we be talking about co-chairs, about equal numbers of representatives from the parties in this House? And without having something like that, you really have nothing useful. Mr. Speaker, this is just one more broken promise. Our budget is coming up this week, and we'll be reminded again during that budget of how many promises this government has broken. We're going to see that again, I'm sure, this week. But this is one more of those broken promises. And just to kind of go over it, this is not a non-partisan committee. The Prime Minister is going to be controlling it. It's not a parliamentary committee. It doesn't have the powers of a parliamentary committee, and what the committee has given it, this government, what the committee gave it in its work, this government is now taking away from it. And the point is, I guess, if it was going to be effective, it wouldn't be under the control of the Prime Minister, Minister of Public Safety. It would be under the control of the members of Parliament who sit on that committee. And if they're equal numbers, they're sharing the chairmanship, we could see how this committee might work effectively. But this government has made a decision that they're not going to do things that way, and that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate for the government. that they have to find themselves in a situation like this today, but it's even more unfortunate for Canadians that they're going to end up paying for another mistake that's being made by this Liberal government.
Next thing come on to questions. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, what I find is unfortunate is that the Conservative Party is completely out of touch with what Canadians really want on this issue. The Prime Minister made a commitment to bring in parliamentary oversight, and that's exactly what this bill does, Mr. Speaker. It is a promise kept by this Prime Minister. It seems to be only the Conservative Party that really does not support parliamentary oversight. The member across the way focuses his attention on the powers of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister works in consultation with the leaders of the opposition in order to assist in those appointments, and some of those appointments. The government members is actually a minority on the committee itself. Mr. Speaker, in many ways, this legislation is more robust than legislation where we have, as a part of the Five Eyes nations, where we have parliamentary oversight. My question to the member is, would the member ultimately argue then that the EU parliamentary oversight system, the New Zealand parliamentary oversight system, that those systems are fundamentally flawed because we have some areas that are more robust than those areas? It just seems to me the Conservatives oppose.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, my colleague across the way is scrambling this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I understand the committee did a lot of hard work on this. They came up with a number of amendments and that would have given powers to this committee. It would have made it nonpartisan. Appointments would not have been made by the Prime Minister. It would have brought in an acceptable level of accountability, transparency. And the government's rejected those amendments. And so Canadians need to be paying attention tonight when we vote. They need to take a look at what the government is doing to this committee, because when they're done, it will have little review. It will have no transparency. It will not have the accountability that it should have. It will not have powers of subpoena, even though other parliamentary committees do have that authority. This committee does not need to be an extension of the Prime Minister's office. That seems to be what the government is bound and determined that they're going to make it.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for his comments on this issue. And since we're talking about here in the House today about the fact that Canadians are watching and what Canadians understand, I wonder if maybe we can have highlighted in this House here once again for Canadians just exactly what is happening, because some of the recent comments that were just made by the honourable member from the governing party doesn't really delve into what really is happening and what Canadians are concerned about. So I wonder if my colleague would again discuss some of the issues with regards to parliamentary oversight in the counterpart Five Eyes nations, some of the shortcomings that our committee here actually proposes, which are about appointing the chairperson. Does he think that there is a risk with no trust from Canadians if the books aren't handed over to the government and other information that's being withheld? Maybe the member can expand on some of those shortcomings.
Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish I had more time to speak to this today, because it's important that Canadians understand what the government's doing here. And actually, it's important that they understand the work that the committee did. So we've got committees with all members on it working together to try to make this bill better. They bring back amendments here, and the government rejects amendments that were made by committees in which they have the majority of the people on that committee. We need to make sure that this thing has transparency. The government is going to remove that tonight with their vote. I'm told there are multiple locking mechanisms, you might call them that, entrenched in C-22 that block committees from accessing information and calling witnesses. The government is making sure that those locks are in place so that the committee is not going to be able to do the work that it should. We need to make sure that this committee is nonpartisan. The government's not guaranteeing that. Its chair and its members should not be appointed by the Prime Minister, and we need to see that that's happened. This committee needs to be appointed by, and Mr. Speaker, most importantly, it needs to report back, not to the Prime Minister, but it needs to report back to Parliament. If it could do that, perhaps it could do some work that would be really valuable for Canadians.
We have time for just a very short question and response. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for Cypress Hills Grassland, although I don't think I agreed with a single thing he said, but we are friends. I want to know if he can explain why the previous Conservative government and the 41st Parliament in Omnibus Budget Bill C-38, which did not allow for any amendments or any discussion and used time allocation at every stage, eliminated the office of the Inspector General for CSIS, the only internal oversight that used to exist for CSIS. By the way, I think we need to bring that back as well as a parliamentary committee.
Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're here today to talk about Bill C-22 and the government's committee that they're setting up and establishing for the future here. And so what I would say is that, again, we need to come back to this, that this committee needs to have authority. It needs to report back to Parliament, not to the Prime Minister. It needs to be appointed by Parliament and needs to be able to do a good job of intelligence oversight, or else we're just pretending that we've got something that we don't.
On reprise ce débat.